The dark side of the Internet. Carl Gustav Jung suggested that everything we feel about or see in another person is comprised of about 75% of our own stuff, our infamous shadow, that is, the unconscious aspects of ourselves, which we project, in either positive or negative ways, onto others. But in reality, such perceptions really have nothing to do with the other person. A more accurate indicator of an individual's character and intentions are based on one-on-one interactions with them in real life, from a place of grounded awareness of self and the experiences which accompany that work. As you can probably guess, shadow projection is even more amplified within the sheltered realms of the online world in comparison to real, face-to-face interactions. All of us can engage in shadow projection at any given moment, without exception. Ask yourself, how many times have you looked at photos of a person and projected qualities good or bad onto her or him that are actually completely off base? How often have you been attracted to or infatuated with, or repelled and offended by, a person, based solely on the content of his/her posts or their appearance in pics? How often do we project emotions and tone onto other people's posts that are not really there in the context of the content, but are merely arising out of our own unconscious shadow? Consider, also, that the mood frame of mind we are in, when an attempt at communication takes place, can distort the interpretation of that message. For example, a person who is sending an online text or writing a social media post may be smiling whilst doing so, and is offering it to others from a genuinely good heart space, grounded in positive feelings, but the receiver reader is on a different vibrational wavelength, and misreads the context of the content, seeing it as full of resentment, or perhaps finds it offensive. The misunderstanding, in such circumstances, is based on assumptions which are grounded in the reader's own issues and stories. Sometimes, when I've met people in real life with whom I had previously connected via Facebook, I can see how my perception of them, be it positive or negative, was off in parts, and I come to realize how much I had projected qualities onto that person, based completely on Facebook interactions, posts, pics and nothing more, which were not true. The shadow is, so to say, the blind spot in your nature. It's that which you won't look at about yourself. You can recognize who it is by simply thinking of the people you don't like. They correspond to that person whom you might have been, otherwise they wouldn't mean very much to you. People who excite you either positively or negatively have caught something projected from yourself. I don't know whether you've had similar experiences in your life, but there are people I despise the minute I see them. These people represent those aspects of myself, the existence of which I refuse to admit to myself. Joseph Campbell. Facebook or any social media portal, and the internet in general, is a great tool to connect with people and share information, but understanding shadow projection, and how we really don't see others as they truly are at times, is worth thinking about. Let's be clear here, it's okay to not like a person, nor is there any need to become best friends with everyone. However, if we get triggered by someone out of proportion and attack him/her personally or engage in gossiping, then there is usually more at play than just the other person's behavior and attitude. But even if we see negative traits in another person that are true, without us becoming heavily triggered in response, can we still come to a place of compassion and empathy about their demeanor? Most of the time, people who act this way are deeply wounded and hurt individuals, compensating for their low self-esteem, due to childhood wounding and other trauma by lashing out or goading others into reactivity. By the way, I'm talking here about everyday people in everyday interactions, not full-blown psychopaths or sociopaths who have no conscience. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Carl G. Jung. In shadow projecting, we split off from and try to get rid of a part of ourselves, which is a self-mutilation that is actually an act of violence. In the act of shadow projecting, we disassociate from a part of ourselves and split in two, turning away in revulsion from and severing our association with our darker half. As if we have never met it before in our entire life, we throw our own darkness outside of ourselves and see it as if it exists only in others. We then react violently when we encounter an embodied reflection of our shadow in the outer world, wanting to destroy it, as it reminds us of something dark within ourselves that we'd rather have nothing to do with. In the act of shadow projecting, we perpetrate violence, both psychic and/or physical, not only on ourselves, but on the other who is the recipient of our shadow projection. This act of external violence is nothing other than our inner process of doing violence to a part of ourselves, changing channels and expressing itself in, as in through the external world, in trying to destroy our projected shadow in the outer world. However, we act out, become possessed by and incarnate the very shadow we are trying to destroy, Paradoxically, in descending into the depths of the unconscious in order to deal with the prima materia of the shadow, we are simultaneously on the path of ascending to the truly real, as we become introduced to the higher, dimensional light worlds of spirit. Paul Levy dispelling Wetiko. The following questions can help anyone to become more familiar with their shadow side. From Knowing Your Shadow by Robert Augustus Masters. What do I least want others to know about me? What do I tend to have a disproportionate reaction to? What am I offended by? What person keeps triggering or irritating me? What qualities of mine or others do I often feel aversion toward? Which emotions do I consider to be bad or wrong? Which emotions am I the least comfortable expressing? What am I most scared to openly express or share? I want to make one point clear. There are limitations to the idea of shadow projection and its ramifications, which ties into the oversimplified saying, when you spot it, you got it, which is not always true. Sometimes, it is verifiable that we are merely projecting our own internal blind spots onto others, and it is actually our stuff which requires self-ownership and healing. But there are other times where it is not our own issues that we are pointing out in another person or situation, that we are, in fact, seeing the other person or situation clearly as he/she it truly is, in good faith. The point is, it's not a black and white circumstance, and discernment, as always, is paramount. There's no denying that shadow projection is a reality in our lives, be it from the receiving end, or engaging in shadow projection ourselves. And understanding and applying basic Jungian psychology is important and very helpful, even though many people also seem to oversimplify or distort the concept of the shadow, due to lack of education regarding its principal characteristics, all of which I've experienced in my own life, especially on the internet, where shadow projection is happening a lot. However, it's not to be used as the only lens through which to see things, because there are limitations to solely employing that kind of psychological analysis, and it can be hijacked by reality, bypassing New Age programs in order to avoid personal responsibility. This topic will be explored later in this blog. Those on the receiving end of this behavior can wind up doing it to others as well. Of course, I've also judged opponents and projected beliefs, and my own shadow onto them, based on who I think they are. But who am I to judge another person's experience, let alone someone else's life? What do we really know of another person's unique soul lessons, karma, past lives, what they are going through on a daily basis, their struggles, worries, fears, joys and happiness, where they are at now, as opposed to looking through the lens of the past, things they have never expressed to anyone else and are most oftentimes impossible to put into words? There is no telling how much I might change in the future, just as one wouldn't draw a lasting conclusion about oneself on the basis of a brief experience of indigestion. One needn't do so on the basis of how one has thought or behaved for vast stretches of time in the past. A creative change of inputs to the system, learning new skills, forming new relationships, adopting new habits of attention, may radically transform one's life. Sam Harris. Sometimes when I get into an argument with a friend and we trigger each other, or when I become annoyed reactivated by others in daily life or on the internet, I think how easier it all would be if we could just inhabit the other person for a minute or two, feeling and thinking exactly as they do, from their perspective. It's a simple relational practice which helps me to get more in touch with compassion and empathy. Maybe we need to put on these exchange classes more often, if only the technology already existed, or at the very least, understand the message of this video, and remember it when we find ourselves triggered in everyday life. Our world is a moment-to-moment classroom of constant lessons. With the rise of social media, I see a lot of bullying, gossiping, and pseudo-psychoanalyzing happening over the internet, alongside an endless shower of ad hominem attacks. The World Wide Web represents a reflection of people's own shadow being triggered, and subsequently projected, essentially offering up their own unconscious individualized pain for all to witness. Think of Monica Lewinsky, which you will, especially with regards to the conspiracies which lurked beneath the Clinton incident. But this is great talk about this topic, an issue that is like an elephant in the living room of our postmodern cyber age. It doesn't always have to be on as grand of a scale as she has experienced it. Some people seem to feed off of that kind of behavior, aside from the obvious trolls and agents who try to give genuine debaters a hard time, when there is no rational, compassionate interaction and feedback with each other but rather, just a retreat into personal attacks and shaming, even if it's hidden behind humor and sarcasm. Then we have already lost that which makes us human, and, in a sense, become what we're fighting against. The abuse of humor is a topic of its own, regarding when comedy and jokes are used to attack others with passive aggressiveness, or to cover up our own wounds, due to our unconscious fear of facing the shadow within. Sarcasm is not just heartless, but is cruel. In it we target whatever we can in the other to belittle or make fun of in circumstances that usually are far from funny. Sarcasm means that we're not only being aggressive but also shaming, building ourselves up by trying to tear down the other, perhaps taking some pleasure in doing so, however short-lived it may be. Sarcasm creates relational distance, so that later on we might find that our target has put up some sort of a barrier against us, even if they're being otherwise loving toward us. This may not be an act of retaliation, but simply a result of feeling on guard around us, especially if they've not received any genuine apology from us for our sarcasm toward them. Left unattended, sarcasm is an intimacy destroyer. Robert Augustus Masters. Moreover, as I mentioned before, looking at it from a hyperdimensional perspective, there are certain entities which feed off of the drama and fighting. Given the buffet table of negative emotions, passive overt aggressiveness, sarcasm and projections that arise during such occasions. Speaking of sarcasm, here's a good video on the psychology of sarcasm. I see many people speaking out about the atrocities and injustices of the world, and oftentimes it comes with a lot of finger-pointing and hostility. Understandable. Who wouldn't be upset? The problems of the world often seem insurmountable, and sometimes the weight of life wears down even the best of us. As important as honoring our healthy boundaries and anger is, dwelling in anger causes us to miss out on the richness of higher understanding. It's important to keep in mind that the moment we demonize or vilify those who disagree with us or do things differently, we commit an act of violence by severing an opportunity to learn and find loving empathy and compassion to resolve conflict. We cannot hold on to spite and vengeance, for the problems of the world are too enormous, and hostility, no matter how small, simply creates more violence. We must become more mindful, understanding, and conscious in our behavior if we are to ask others to do the same. Time shows us that even in the most dark of circumstances, there is understanding and love to be found, within and without, for all things serve a purpose in objective reality. As difficult as it can be to come to terms with, all moments of life are like lessons in the school of earth. It is rightfully natural to be angry, afraid, sad, and defensive, passively or aggressively, but for the sake of transformation and growth, we must not stop there. Justice is neither avoidance or vengeance. It is taking responsibility by utilizing the opportunity to see things clearly through gaining knowledge, healing, and, ultimately, understanding and finding forgiveness by seeing the greater context, which ultimately leads to compassion. With communication comes new perspective. With new perspective comes new understanding. With understanding comes connection. With connection comes love. And in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Umberto Braga. Sometimes we also tend to share too much, too fast, in our eager attempts to share the personal realizations, experiences, process, research, or discoveries we have made, which some people are simply not ready to hear. A lesson I've learned the hard way myself as well. If you do find an extraordinary truth, shall we say, from extraordinary evidence, more than likely, then in the course of your life, if you come upon that, you quickly learn there was a path to that view, and it may be complex, it may be simple, but there was a way to it. You don't jump straight to it without the intermediate stages, and the more remarkable that truth is, the longer it takes to deeply acknowledge and know it at a very inner level. Yet, we can observe that there is sort of a tremendous impulse to want to share our discoveries with people and to prove to them and to underline things and expound what we believe. But everybody has to wake up for him or herself. I've said this over and over. You cannot really do it for anyone else, so it is both unrealistic and unwise to expect someone touted in a mainstream view of politics and culture and education to suddenly entertain certain fringe ideas. The more outstanding the revelation, the longer it takes to get to it. So we have to sort of respect that in a way. We have to expect also that it takes time for people to understand what is real and what is unreal. All we can do is set forth our discoveries and let people make of it what they will. And that takes discipline and a high degree of self-confidence, and amongst academics that is not always to be taken for granted, because it is not just academic discipline, but it is personal disciple in your own growth and your own being, not just the computer element of our minds but all of the rest of the faculties as well. And if we falter in our convictions, if we constantly need validation and reassurance, then we start to compromise even our own materials. It is better not to do that at all. Just play your own game. do your own thing and get as sharp and authentic as you can, and don't stop and keep doing it. And it brings to mind the question of what actually is it when we say truth, and I very much feel, having worked with all levels of sort of philosophers, and academics, and psychologists, and mystics, and New Agers, that being smart is not sufficient to know the truth, and I would say that the truth reveals itself slowly depending on the intellectual, emotional, transcendental awareness of the individual, and those last two elements are sorely lacking in the average investigator, I would say, so their inquiry is necessarily therefore flat and rather one-dimensional. It is limited, to put it politely, like a person who cannot see the real substance of a situation because he does not really get it. He lacks sincerity, humility, and insight. Neil Kramer. Sometimes in our zeal to share our awakening process, we say more than we should about what we've discovered. It could be shocking to someone else's view of reality who is less aware, and then they, in their lack of awareness and cognitive dissonance, will doubt you and make you wrong, then tell others about your problems and so on. This really hurts when you discover someone you trusted is gossiping behind your back, poisoning others' views and beliefs about you which are not true. The list is endless really, but the point I'm making is that discernment of character, and especially spiritual discernment, is a fine art of deepening one's awareness, sensitivity, patience and wisdom. It takes a humility and courageousness that cannot really be done alone, and yet it sometimes feels like we are all alone when we are going through the dark night of the soul. Large in all of this shows the negative side of social media and the internet. When people only communicate by typing words on a screen, it tends to cut us off from our body and emotions. A lot of communication happens non-verbally when we look into each other's eyes while sharing physical space together. Body language and energetic impressions oftentimes reveal more than words which are spoken or typed. Words are very limiting as well. Expressing what I feel and have experienced through language has, at times, been very challenging. This is often due to the fact that many people project different meanings into words, or that we use certain words but are actually trying to convey a different meaning. Personal contact, as in face-to-face connections, also helps us to be more compassionate towards one another, looking into each other's eyes. Sometimes, we also just need a hug and to be approached with compassion, even or especially, when we make mistakes, and seek understanding without being condemned, judged, psychoanalyzed and labeled for our issues, especially if we share views that challenge people's beliefs, which often leads to being prosecuted by strangers behind a computer screen. I remember working with a professional Gestalt therapist a couple of years ago. She embraced everything that came up for me without any judgment, but with plenty of empathy and compassion. There was no psychoanalysis or application of any psychological labels, no reading quotes to me from psychology books or telling me that I should read this or that, no informing me that I should feel ashamed or bad for my failings and mistakes, which were actually not mistakes but unconscious defense mechanisms which served their purpose. On the contrary, she helped me to feel good about myself, not so that I could rationalize away anything I did or thought in the past, but so I could experience forgiveness for myself and others, and so that I could understand how all of it related to things in my upbringing which I was not fully aware of, mostly childhood wounding, past life trauma and energetic karma. This was all accomplished by guiding me into my body and emotions, a place where the rational analytical mind cannot go. This process and empathetic approach helped to release and heal deep wounds. I was crying many times during these sessions as my psychological and bodily armor was dissolving. Doing this kind of work one-on-one in a private safe container with eye contact is also very important. Something way deeper emerges if we take this kind of physical approach, which is impossible to replicate in an online consultation. Besides imparting to the reader the positive effects of professional embodied psycho-spiritual therapy, the point of this recollection is to reinforce the importance of relating to each other with more compassion, empathy, and forgiveness. You don't need to be an expert in psychology to do this. The healing of our present woundedness may lie in recognizing and reclaiming the capacity we have to heal each other, the enormous power in the simplest of human relationships, the strength of a touch, the blessing of forgiveness, the grace of someone else taking you just as you are and finding in you an unsuspected goodness. Everyone alive has suffered. It is the wisdom gained from our wounds and from our own experiences of suffering that makes us able to heal. Becoming expert has turned out to be less important than remembering and trusting the wholeness in myself and everyone else. Expertise cures, but wounded people can best be healed by other wounded people. Only other wounded people can understand what is needed, for the healing of suffering is compassion, not expertise. Rachel Naomi Remen, MD.